All right. Happy Friday afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another MSP Cyber Roundtable. We've got Matt Topper joining us today from Connectwise. We're really excited about it. We got a lot of rain in Toledo today, and it looks like Matt's traveling. So I'm curious to ask where you're at.
So New Orleans for the CompTIA year-end planning meeting today. We're wrapped up this afternoon, or it's 2:30 here, 1:30 here. Um, Fantastic group of people. So we're talking about initiatives for next year and just how we can help CompTIA better themselves. And credit to them for asking for extremely candid feedback. Right, that was the organization is willing to do that. So I give them a lot of credit for saying,
Yeah.
tell us what we need to improve.
Yeah. Oh man, that's important. I mean, feedback is the only way you can get perspective that you don't already have of your own. So that's awesome when organizations are open to that.
Yeah, for sure. And so I'll just apologize in advance for the hotel room background, and there's not great lighting here, but you know what? We're gonna make it work.
From your angle, it looks like they have you set up in the largest king bed that I've ever seen in my entire life.
Nope,
Either
just two
either that
queens.
or it's two queens. Yeah, yeah.
Oh,
I want to get the big king bed. That would be pretty awesome. Is that like hyper California king, like continent king?
Continental king. I like that. You'll have to trademark that and sell it to Sofa King. There you go. Well, we've got an exciting conversation today. We're going to be talking about what it looks like to secure your own MSP versus what it looks like to go out there and secure your client. I know both of you are going to have a lot of perspectives on this. It's a really important thing both ways, right? If you don't secure yourself, you're going to be not in good shape in the long term because something's bound to happen, and your clients are going to hate that. And if you don't secure the client, then you're not going to have very many clients. You got to handle that short term. You got to handle that short term responsibility. So it's going to be a great conversation there. We're also doing a control today, right? Matt, it's number
yeah.
12 of CIS.
We're looking at
I know we're
network
both mad.
infrastructure
This will be fun.
management. So I'll be Matt with the blue background. You'll be Matt with the bed background.
There you go.
Yeah, Matt F and Matt T works. In any case, yeah, let's jump right into control of the day. If I can find the button, here we go. So we're looking at CIS Control's Domain 12 or Control 12, Network Infrastructure Management. And this category of network infrastructure management has 8 subcontrols. Um, CIS is split up into 18 different control domains, and inside each one, they've got somewhere between 5 and, in some cases, more than 10 controls that are each individual specific security tasks or functions that need to be completed to accomplish a thing. So in this case, we want secure network infrastructure. Um, when we look at managing network infrastructure, just like with all the other CIS controls, we've got different levels for different organizations of different complexity. CIS has their subcontrols split up into 3 implementation groups: implementation group 1, implementation group 2, implementation group 3. IG1 is for small businesses using off-the-shelf software. They probably don't have any regulated data. Not a big deal if their data leaks, although perhaps they need to keep their systems up or available.
Mhm.
CIS's IG2 is reserved for organizations that have needs that are a little bit more comprehensive than that. They may have their own custom business applications. They may have dedicated IT teams. They probably have some kind of core application system. If they're very small, it's possible they even have regulated data. And then IG3 is for organizations with the highest security need. So these are organizations that are working with highly regulated data, data where leakage could impact human safety, or where a failure of a system could impact human safety. or organizations just really can't afford systems losses are going to fall into that IG3 category. So for network infrastructure management, only one thing is asked for those small businesses in that
I
IG
was gonna I
category.
was gonna point that out. This is like the
Yeah,
only
that's
one
my
that
big takeaway from this one too.
So
what that leads me to guess is this is probably not the thing you go to first in terms of control number 12 if you're doing security.
yeah, CIS does recommend that you work really hard on the first, actually 7 controls or 8 controls before you move further. But even as you move further, when you get to network infrastructure, the absolute only thing they ask for every organization in the world is 12.1. Ensure your network infrastructure is up to date. Make sure it's patched. That's all they're saying, right?
Yeah,
A lot of these network devices have firmware that needs to be manually uploaded. Some of them are automatically updating. Either make sure you have those automatic updates turned on, or make sure that you are regularly reviewing the versions of the software on those appliances, making sure they're upgraded. So this is switches, routers, firewalls, wireless access points, um, other things of that category. Um, and in a small business, hopefully these things are patching themselves. So that's 12.1. As we look at IG2, that's where the meat of this control domain is for organizations that are in that middle level of security. The first thing they ask is 12.2, establish and maintain a secure network architecture. One of the things they're looking at there is, has anyone actually thought about how all these things hook together, right? So do you have an inside and an outside of your network as an example, right? Maybe you're even
which I really think should be IG1. I don't know about you
you-
guys, like how I would almost rather a secure. I mean, they should both. 12.1 and 12.2, in my opinion, IG1. Right, the architecture isn't, especially in a small business. You're not talking about making hundreds of VLANs with extreme complexity. Right, secure network architecture means you're just piggybacking off of the LAN, right? And there's no reason that any business should not be doing that.
Yeah, I think one of the things, and this is where CIS sort of falls down for service providers. In general, CIS is really a great fit for most service providers because it's highly attuned towards the things that service providers are good at. But when they designed this control, I know what they were thinking. They were thinking um, small businesses that don't have an IT department don't have the
Yeah,
staff to do 12.2 through 12.8. But if they have a service provider, if you're an MSP, you do have the skills to do these things, and you should definitely be doing that. And yeah, I mean, for a lot of small businesses, like it plugging into the wall is like they're like green light, it works. Like that's their skill set, right?
yeah,
So I think, and I think one of the things they're going out of their way to say is, if that's the only skill set you have, right? Figure out how to make sure this thing's up to date as well, right? Um,
yes.
But
Yeah, I
then,
would agree
yeah, I
with
mean,
that.
you do need someone that understands an inside of a network versus an outside versus should there be a DMZ? Although that concept's going away these days, right? Should there be separate networks for personal devices or work devices or printers, right? All
What
those.
does DMZ stand for? I'm not so sure I'm familiar with that one.
I'm dating myself here. Demilitarized zone, which comes from military parlance, but what it really means is that there's a part of the network that you can reach from the outside, but isn't fully inside.
Yeah.
And that whole concept is sort of going away
The
because
whole
this
network concept is going away
is yeah,
slowly.
yeah.
How does that work?
So if you think about a hyper modern MSP, it's not even hyper modern anymore. It's just sort of the new standard paradigm. So you have a lot of SaaS applications. With the advent of COVID, you might be working from the coffee shop, working from the airport, working from home, working from anywhere, and
The
you've left
hotel,
that.
maybe, Matt
Yeah,
T.
right. You might be on the
With your,
road trying to
with
do
your
a live stream.
Continental King.
Right, and so you've left that shell of the normal mode of operation network, and if you're on something serverless, where everything is a SaaS application, maybe it's a company that you started this year or last year, and from day one, you don't have any servers, you don't have any infrastructure. The network just becomes a conduit to access your SaaS applications. And so in that sense, the network itself, I don't want to say it's less critical or less important. It's just plumbing at that point. You're not worried about routing and where to place your servers and that. It's just a way to get to the internet. And from a holistic security perspective, you have to assume that your employee might be on a hotel Wi-Fi network or in the coffee shop or at the airport. And so the focus on the network, or having that, almost castle and moat kind of theory, that's what I mean by starting to go away.
It definitely is, and I think that this version of CIS was published before COVID, certainly, before Zero Trust was anything but a white paper, right? I think that we're going to see updates to this model over time, but also
Yeah.
remember, CIS is not a cookbook on how to build a network or how to build an organization's infrastructure. It is simply a remediation architecture that stops 95% of cyber attacks. So if you look at it from the perspective of, instead of what to build, it's more like how to stop the attacks, right? Which you might think, well, that's what security is supposed to be all about, right? But their design goal was stop 95% of attacks, not 96% or 99%, exactly 95%. So they made some
Yeah.
some compromises there, right? To what's easy, what's fast to break these attack chains, right?
Yeah, and my tangent again about the changing paradigm doesn't in any way invalidate the usefulness of this for the vast majority of clients that do still have some on-prem infrastructure. Most
Yep.
of our clients are not there yet.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
Good point.
And of course, we've all got kids who use TikTok that's scanning the network, right? As you bring your secure devices home for the day. Something to
Yes.
consider.
Your house is a hostile network, right?
That's for sure.
Your own house is not work area.
12.3 is securely manage the network infrastructure. They are talking specifically about how do you log into those devices, right? Are you using a secure authentication method, and is the transport security something that can be trusted? So it should be encrypted. There should be a password on it. The password should be something that you can trust. So it's either a rotated service account, or even better, as we get it further down this list, you've done single sign-on. So which leads into 12.4, establish and maintain network architecture diagrams. This is super important because um, the way I look at it, or here's what I've seen in the world. Sometimes the first time someone ever actually thinks about how their whole network plugs together is the first time they write it down as a diagram. It creates a certain type of thinking, a certain type of analysis that you only go through when you write it down. In addition to that, other people need to see this diagram too, right? If you have a team of people, everyone should be on the same page. Otherwise, you're going to end up with stuff plugged in the wrong place, right?
Yeah, and how often is the write it down exercise the result of it being audit time, and someone says, get the network diagram ready for this audit coming up?
Yeah, and it's the auditor doesn't really care about the diagram either. What they want to know is that you've gone through the exercise and that everyone's on the same page, right?
Yeah.
So it's an easy thing to do. You can use a whiteboard even, right? And this one connects to if we go back to the data flows, and I believe CIS 3, there's a similar diagram for tracking data. This one's all about the network devices, the physical devices, and the physical devices that are plugged into the physical devices, and the virtual devices that might be on them, but it's not necessarily what data is where and how it moves, which is a different diagram. Although you could do both exercises at the same time, save yourself a lot of effort, right? 12.5, and I hinted at this in 12.3, centralized network authentication and authorization and auditing. So authentication is, how do we verify that this person who wants to access this thing is the person who we think they are? Authorization, what are they allowed to access, right? And are they accessing the thing that they're supposed to be allowed to access? And then auditing, are we keeping logs of this stuff? Can we track back and figure out who did what when? So this is both logging into the devices, the routers and switches, but it's also getting access to a network, right? Which might be
Yes.
virtually, or an application, right? With an application gateway in the cloud world or SaaS world, or it might be even physically plugging into a network, or the Wi-Fi in my office is doing this,
Mm.
right? It asks you username and password to get on Wi-Fi. So that's what this one's about, 12.5.
And that can be difficult to do in many devices, right? If you have some standalone managed switch or firewall or edge device, getting it configured to be able to log in with the Active Directory or some type of authentication system, or like TACX in the Cisco world, one, that can be difficult to set up, and two, now it changes your disaster recovery and business continuity planning, in that if your authentication system goes down, now you have this whole additional
Yep,
thing to deal with, glass access and all that.
it adds complexity for sure. I mean, most even consumer level devices these days frequently have these types of authentication methods built into them, but managing them, right, making them all work together can be challenging. The easiest thing to do is to pick an ecosystem and that solves all, checks all the boxes, and buy all the stuff from the same vendor. It makes and make sure your customers are on all the same
Yeah,
infrastructure, so that you can do the same thing. The hard thing is figuring out how to do it, right? Once
right.
you have that footprint, repeating it is much easier. So
Yeah, there's a
um,
lot of cloud managed ecosystems. I won't drop any names or anything like that, but many vendors do have some type of centralized cloud management. We're not in the days of
yeah, I
logging
think
into each device anymore.
almost all of them do these days. You can either host it yourself, or you can connect into some type of cloud. Um, So 12.6, use secure network management and communication protocols. So I hinted at that back in 12.3 about, transport security for when you're managing things. But this goes a little bit, and so this is saying, yeah, make sure that that's, you know, make sure that it's HTTPS and not HTTP, right? Make sure that it's SSH and not Telnet. Or these days, there's other options as well. When you look at those integrated management panes that go back to the cloud, make sure that those are built securely and make sure they're implemented securely, right? Um, and 12.7, and this is the last one for IG2, which is for most organizations, if they get up to 12.7, which I'm about to tell you, are doing most of the things they should be doing in network infrastructure security. Ensure remote devices utilize a VPN and are connecting to an enterprise's, um, they say AAA infrastructure, but what they really mean is single sign-on, right, or
Yeah,
identity
yeah,
management infrastructure. um, I think they're concerned about the VPN, or they mention the VPN because they're concerned about the local networks you may be on, right? I think, again, this framework's dating itself a little bit. These days, everyone's on TLS applications. We've got HSTS, which ensures you're connecting over HTTPS when you're connecting to web applications. I think there is value in also having that secure network infrastructure, that so that you know that when you're just browsing the internet, you're on a safe pathway, and you know that when you're accessing company applications, that there's no one's able to hijack that, or look at that on the network. Um, However, I think that the world, in this flat network world where we can't trust any
yeah.
network, right? That idea of utilizing a VPN may be becoming redundant pretty soon. But
And I think,
definitely, yeah.
oh, go ahead. Go ahead, cutting you
Well,
off.
definitely the single sign-on stuff is like super important, and one of the things that they're looking at here in this control is tying together this idea of securely accessing the company's network with accessing the applications, right? That's all secure access, but you can do one without the other.
Yeah, and I think it's important to, if you're considering how to design this for clients across your customer base, um, VPN doesn't need to be VPN the way we know it. It could be some type of tunneling application or SASE provider or anything like that as well. Not just VPN back to the office.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, there's creative products these days. There's are we still calling them CASBs, the cloud access security brokers and stuff like that, and the application gateways that you can stick in front of your business line applications and your company's SaaS. And not only can you stick those gateways in place, but you can use them for things like Office 365, right? But you can
Yeah.
make sure that the encryption is controlled at that gateway level, and that would satisfy the needs of this control as well. As long as you're getting all of the company applications, covered that way.
I see CASB these days as being a feature in many products. I don't see it as often as a standalone. Here's a CASB. I'm sure there's still some out there, but usually it seems to be like it's part of the bigger suite of tools.
That's right. I mean, identity and access management's hard, so it's not unusual to buy your identity management solution at the same time as your gateway solution, or your firewall at the same time as your application gateway solution.
Yeah.
And then 12.8, the last one here in this domain, this is really only for IG3. So the thing about IG3 is they're expecting that you have dedicated cybersecurity resources to operate these controls. And what this 12.8 control says is establish and maintain a dedicated computing resources for all administrative work. What that used to work, if we rewind to the 90s, it was not unusual for this concept to look like a second computer on the desk that was literally colored red, and it was connected to the top secret network, right? And the military did quite a bit of that, and sometimes they even had 3 machines, because you'd have one connected to the internet, another one connected to SIPRnet, another one connected to the local application. These days, what they're saying is, first of all, if you absolutely can't tolerate a cybersecurity incident that impacts, right, you need to be doing this for all administrative work. So that's creating users, right, changing configurations on network appliances, definitely changing any access group or security setting, as well as anything you might use, like if you're logging into a system that might need administrative privileges. Those administrative privileges should be via this dedicated computing environment. You can use an extra machine. You can use a virtual jump host is pretty popular these days. There's a few different ways of skinning this one. I don't know
Done with.
what.
I've seen it done with cloud VMs these days,
Yep.
and then if you are, I'll use the Microsoft terminology, but it's not just a Microsoft thing. Then limiting administrative login via conditional access policy to only allow admin cloud machines. But you do of course run into this, makes it a more complex planning exercise, because you need to have some type of break glass access into that, right? Say your administrative workstation, an update goes into it, and now you can't get into the cloud machine anymore. You have to have a wait area. So that's one of the reasons that it's an IG3. And this actually, I think, when we get to it, leads us into a discussion on our next topic. As far as our topic today, you're doing administrative work on client networks all the time from your local LAN workstations at your MSP.
When you say administrative work, what does that entail? Because it sounds really vague.
It is vague.
It's particularly challenging at MSPs, right? Because they're like, everything's administrative. That's my job. I'm the administrator, right? That's.
I'll tell you what I did. I treated internal access changes and administrative work like for things within our own organization, is how I defined it for the sake of that control. So if we needed to change someone's access in Azure AD, or if we needed to reset a user's password, that would happen from an administrative workstation. Day-to-day administrative work at clients, that didn't require separate dedicated administrative workstations, though it did, of course, impact how we configured technician workstations, because that gets into, you're doing sensitive operations, right? You're not just browsing at your own device, right? Your own device is not a playground device. It's a relatively, or not relatively, it's a controlled environment.
So I know we covered that subject or a related subject when we went over identity management to talk about the same thing, about this separation of the administrative user, right? Having a separate user account. So if you have that separate user account, the thing that makes sense is, well, anything that requires that separate user should also be on a separate, management environment, right?
Yes.
So when you're logging into that identity, use the secure workspace. When you're logging into your normal user identity, use your normal workspace. But yeah, where to divide that line is an exercise that, as a service provider, you need to decide what's sensitive, right? If you open up a security book, right, one of the things that they will point you to is this concept of a security kernel. It's like a old language there. So what's inside the security kernel is the
Is it
things that change
Colonel like popcorn or Colonel like Sanders?
It's like the core, the security core, like the most
Security
trusted
core.
place in security. What they say is if there's a piece of the system that moderates how the rest of the system enforces security, that's inside that secure kernel or enclave. Sometimes people use that word these days. But so if you have tasks that as an administrator you're performing, that when you perform that task, you actually could create security issues, right? If you did them wrong, or if someone else like had access to that, and could they open up a door for someone else, right? If that's the nature of that administrative work, that should be on an administrative user on an administrative workstation, right? And if you're not changing the way the whole security model works, right, and you're just in your access groups, you're just doing your normal everyday tasks, maybe that is something you do with your normal user. But I think the line in the sand is something that everyone needs to figure out. It's all about sensitivity and what you're trying to protect, right?
Agreed. Not a one size fits all answer on this one. And, I hate the it depends cliche as consulting advice, but it's one of those things where you need to really evaluate your own risk tolerance and say, okay, is the when you're thinking of the kind of work you do, it also is not benefit or you lose separation if you end up being on the administrative workstation all day anyway, right? That you get not as much benefit from that if you decide, okay, everything I do at a client is going to be sensitive, and now all I've really done is taken my what used to be my sensitive security desktop, and now I'm doing everything on it, right? It's kind of desktop at that point.
So, we're talking about securing the MSP versus securing the client, right? And so there's a lot of arguments for if you're selling it to your client, you should be doing it yourself. And then there's arguments that say, well, but maybe you need to be more secure than your client, or maybe your business needs are totally separate from your client. I'll tell you one difference with us. We use Amazon to back our application architecture, right? But
Mm-hmm.
most of our clients are running in Azure. And the reason why is our business needs are different, right? And we use the product that works best for us, even though it's not the same product that works best for our clients. Um,
I,
so
I would be of the mindset that a service provider would need more security just by nature of touch points. And I mean, that would be my guess, right? If you would have given me a multiple choice question and made me guess.
So the answer I think is maybe. Again, from the service provider aspect, you have that force multiplier effect in that if you are compromised, the amount of damage is significant. But let's say, just for a hypothetical example, if you are a service provider with two clients and they're both not high risk versus a bank or a hospital, right? Which one needs more security, your MSP or the bank or the hospital case?
You're good. You're good at moving that ball around in the cups, man. I wouldn't have. I wouldn't have. Yeah, I wouldn't have gotten to that on my own. But that makes perfect sense.
and most MSPs, I'm generalizing here. This is not always true, but most MSPs are smaller than their target clients. Sometimes they're the
Wouldn't
same
that
size, and sometimes they're bigger, but they're usually
wouldn't
smaller.
that wouldn't that beg the question though that they would need to, from like a third party risk perspective? And again, I may be way off base here, but wouldn't it suggest that they would need tighter controls by way of touch points?
It depends, Matt. So you've got people
I
have
like
asked me this
that answer.
before, and
We just end the webinar. It depends. That's the answer to everything.
It really seems safe. I'm gonna strap that to my tool belt. I'm gonna start carrying that
should we
one around.
talk about some examples, Matt? Because I know that you've run into this one over and over, right? It's a conversation you've had with people a lot. So what are the real world situations that come up where people have a difficult time orienting themselves around them versus the client?
Yeah, so let's recap the conversation we had. Maybe it was on IT Nation. I can't remember. This comes up frequently when you start talking into this mantra of dog fooding, and I think that's so. Let's define what we mean by that, right? So usually when you hear dog fooding, you're thinking about using software you wrote for yourself. In the MSP world, it gets into setting yourself up internally using all the same tooling and configuration you would at a client. Um, and that's an idea that I get it, right? The idea of the necessity to test things and get your support staff experience and learning about the intricacies of the product and letting your entire staff find the issue. I think what gets confusing here and what may be more effective is piloting internally versus necessarily having to use the same architecture and tooling, because we just said the risk profile is it depends for everything, right? And all we mean by that is it's not necessarily the same. It might be, it might not be. And as a result of that, having the exact same tool set doesn't necessarily make sense. And here's an example, right? And I won't name any specific product. First, talk about categories. So let's say that you're talking about a vulnerability management solution. You find something that you think is the perfect tool to detection, finds finds the apps you care about, and it doesn't have multi-tenancy. Now, is that the right tool is that the right tool for use internally? Not become the right tool just because you need something else for your clients that does support multi-tenancy, that does integrate with your ticketing system. And again, to use the tired phrase, maybe, right? And I think all that we're saying here is your tool selection, your configuration, your architecture decisions need to match the risk profile and the use cases that you have as a company, and they aren't necessarily the same as your clients, right? Your clients don't necessarily have the same security risks. You know, your RMM is often the crown jewel, or really the IDP that gets you into that RMM in many cases. That's one of the most important things in your environment. That might need more security than your clients, or if you're doing very sensitive government work or very sensitive financial work, you might be in a situation where your clients need more security than you. And I think the trigger for me, if I have one, is this idea of that they always need to be the same, right? Your internal infrastructure may or may not be the same.
So let's talk about both versions of that, right? Where
Yes.
it might be undersized or oversized. Where I'm working with CompTIA in their Trustmark program right now, and they're working to it's all built on dog fooding, right? The what they're looking at is the fact that first of all, MSPs are at all different security levels, right? And so one of the things they're trying to accomplish is have sort of a common ruler for measuring up whether an MSP is secure or not. But the other thing they're looking at is generally just making sure that the MSPs are the securest guy in the room, with the theory that you can't protect the customer if you haven't protected yourself first, right? I think there's some truth to that, and um, in many situations, MSPs don't have enough security. You know, I was talking to one who
Oh,
said,
agreed, 100%.
yeah, I was talking to one guy who said, yeah, we're doing like really awesome patch management for all of our clients, but every time I put in a ticket to like check in, like to chase down vulnerabilities in our environment or do patch management in our environment, it gets kicked because a client request comes in, and that, we make money on those, right? And then the internal thing just gets kicked down the
Yeah.
road, right? And so this idea of setting the same standard for yourself and your clients in that case would accomplish simply getting software updated, right?
Yes.
There's probably a lot of other different versions of like, well, you do this for your client, but you don't do it for yourself, like enabling multi-factor auth on like whatever, I don't.
And
Yeah.
and I think this discussion you're different. We need to differentiate between same standards versus same implementation mechanism, right? You may have the same standards, they don't necessarily need to be implemented the same way, right? So in your example, the need to have everything patched is universal, right? You and your clients both will have that regardless of your security posture, whether you need more or less. Um, you might decide your internal stuff is managed via Intune, right? While your client stuff is managed via your RMM platform. And so I think that's the core of the issue, at least that I'm trying to point out. Implement patch management doesn't necessarily need to be the same as you would use for your client, right? There are many organizations that choose to use different tooling or different techniques to get to that same destination, just because it makes more sense for the way they operate.
I've got a question.
So yeah, go for it.
How does, like, in the world of so I mean, we secure ourselves for all different reasons, right? To protect the goodwill of our brand, to protect the data and the privacy of our clients, and we get cyber insurance to make sure that, in the event that what we've done for our security, in the event that that's not enough, that everybody's still going to be okay. When we're considering securing an MSP versus securing a client, how does that come into play when considering insurance? Because at least from what I've understood, the premiums around an MSP, or the expectations around an MSP, are generally higher. And I imagine there'll be it depends caveat here, but in any case, take me through that.
Well, I mean, you nailed it with the it depends. So the reality of insurance questions is the answer is whatever your carrier says it is. Like I don't like to be that simplistic about it, but when you get down to it, the answer is, hey, insurance carrier, what is going to cause me to not get a claim approved? And that's really the reality of it. It's a discussion between you and your carrier as far as what the requirements are. Um, there should be a discussion about to what legal question. By the way, like this discussion, your attorney and your insurance carrier. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an insurance pro. So I just want to throw that disclaimer in before I start talking about anything about legal and insurance. Because, and by the way, ask your lawyer, not just any.
Yeah, not a YouTube or like a random blog, like a question and answer lawyer.
Right. The one who wrote your service agreement, that's who you should be directing this question to. And if you didn't have one write your service agreement, start by getting that done. There should be a discussion with all of the parties involved in this. To what degree do you think that I face legal liability for things that happen at my client, right? And that gets into clients accepting risk, and do they take your advice? And frankly, it gets into, there's a point where you have to start dropping clients for not taking your advice. But it really does go back to what is going to get this claim denied. That really is the easy answer to insurance questions. And there are some fantastic insurance people in our space that can give a way more in-depth answer about what they've seen on specific carriers and specific requirements.
And then for anyone that's not familiar, there is this idea of the reasonable person test in law. And I'm not giving legal advice right now, but I'm telling you that you should be thinking, what would that reasonable person do in every situation that you work in your organization, it shouldn't be what can you get away with, right? It
Yeah.
would be what would 5 of my peers that I think are doing a good job, what would they do, right?
What
Another
would
way to
12 of
say
my
that.
peers?
Another way to say that is your buddy that's trying to get away with shit. He's not reasonable.
Right,
That's another
right,
way to say
right. So like
Right.
it's what would a reasonable person expect, or what would a reasonable person do, is at the crux of like what the law decides in many cases. And so you can try to be a reasonable person, right? We can all try to be reasonable people, and just put that slant on things when you're working, right? And if you think there's a risk, right, that you're taking that's not a reasonable risk to take, you need to figure out how to deal with that. Change your practices or communicate to your customer they need to change their practices, right?
Yes, and that's a huge point talking about risk, in that the reasonable person rule doesn't only apply to the very end of the sequence that led to whatever the issue is, right? The reasonable person may have said, you really should have addressed this 6 months ago, when the reasonable action to take would have been to do X instead of Y.
That's right. That's right. So yeah, we can't stray further into the legal without
Right, let's get out of here before we say something that's going to get us in legal
Just before
trouble.
we say something that we're going to need a lawyer for.
Right, right. I think we're very clear. Talk to an actual qualified attorney. We're just giving you some general
And there-
high-level
We'll have to
points.
bring an actual qualified attorney on this back.
I've got a guy. There's by the way, there's some great attorneys out there that specialize in
Yeah.
cyber, but also in MSP. So we should dig one of these guys up in the next few weeks,
Yeah,
or
we'll have
I guess
to.
we're probably booking out in late January, February at this point. But I know the guy.
Perfect.
So I, around this whole discussion, there's a phrase that you may have heard me say if you've worked with me. I don't know if you guys have, and that is, I always like to say, you are not your own client. And really, there should be, like, in a brackets or parentheses, you are not necessarily your own client. And I think that sums up this idea of not necessarily configuring everything or using the same tools to implement. You may arrive at the same point, but have an independent look of what your risk factors are and how you're going to address them, as opposed to just saying, hey, I'm going to set up everyone the same way, including us, right? We just talked about, we're often taking administrative actions all day long on our own internal workstations of clients, right? And that conversation around what an administrative action is, or what constitutes a need to use a separate machine. If you're doing that all day on your internal clients, what you don't want is, that your own workstation, like having Steam and, Firefox version 25 installed on it because you need the old Java-based ILO page on some server, right? That's not a good idea. And so really think about how you're going to set up your own internal environment to protect against that, and what, if anything, needs to be different than a client, right? Maybe you have a bunch of those old switches or old server interfaces that need a really old Java version. We'll get like a throwaway laptop to deal with that.
Yeah.
So there's, yeah, go ahead.
I'm a big fan of the virtual jump host, and so I've been recommending for years that not only should you virtualize, you should.
I almost interrupted you earlier when you were going through the control to ask you what the hell a jump host was.
Okay.
So I get a second chance.
So a jump host is there's probably some origins here in the etymology that I don't understand, but a jump host is when you jump into this remotely accessed machine to then access another remotely accessed machine. You have to go through this place to get to that other place. So in security terms, we would call this a constrained interface. There's some other terminology we use for these jump hosts. Sometimes they call them beachheads. But in any case,
Bastion
or
hosts.
access points, yeah, bastion hosts, right? That's really old, Matt. You must be as old as I am. But yeah, so way back when, it was like back when the internet was not quite functioning correctly, you would but when I mean correctly, I mean the internet was in pieces. It wasn't like all one big internet.
Yeah.
You would log into one system to get to another system to get to another system, not for security reasons, but because that was literally the only way to transit the network. Because there wasn't packet access end to end, right? So this is like going back to those days. But
Is
these
it less
days,
used now? Is it just significantly less used now, or does it still have
the
a common function?
it's really common these days when you're a large
It's
organization
super
and
common. Yeah.
when you go to access those business applications, you go to the single sign-on portal and a bunch of icons pop up after you authenticate, access this application, that application. You click on
Oh,
it and you get like a virtual desktop with that application in it.
that makes
And
sense. So
and
that's how you like totally segment out the application away from any way where it could be.
yeah, and so
Yeah.
another version of a jump host might be a permanent machine. But the problem with a permanent machine is that as an administrator, if you do something dumb or insecure, right, you now have a
That
permanent
never
machine
happens.
directly access to the internet that could then be directly access to all this sensitive stuff, and it's just like a back door, and you don't want that, right? So,
Mm.
but I love virtual jump hosts. Uh, you can create a jump host that has, you do strong authentication with your administrative access into this virtual desktop. And then once you have access to that virtual desktop, you can access these other network segments or these other systems. And then when you log out, the thing's gone, wiped, done, like back to stock.
Mm.
Yeah.
And that's people get annoyed, right? Because they can't save any settings, and that's the whole idea, right? So, I mean, I love recommending that because it's relatively, although it's a little annoying to set up. By a little annoying, I mean like there's some configuration steps here, right? Of creating that image, configuring the network properly. But once you have that configured, relatively low cost, low maintenance, right? And you don't even need to buy a big expensive product for this. This is like built into your neighborhood cloud, right? So
Hmm?
it's and it's within the skill set of most service providers to set this up. And so they should, if there's something they consider highly sensitive and they don't want to carry two laptops around or have that machine on their desk painted red, having that virtual infrastructure for those privileged accesses makes a lot of sense.
And you see that in many referenced cloud architectures as well, right? All the AWS references talk about having um, a host inside of the private side of the network that maybe only allows access from certain IPs and has SSH key based and very locked down access. And then only from that host can you then log into on the VPC or other network in there. And same concept in Azure, right? Just different terminology.
Yep. So yeah, that's a jump host, and I think the first time I encountered one, it was only text, because but these days, commonly there are full graphical desktops.
Mm.
You can install
Yeah.
apps, configure software, and treat it like any other desktop.
Mm.
So I think this segues into another discussion around this topic, and I have an opinion. I'm kind of curious to hear your opinion on it, and that is if you subscribe to the you are not necessarily your client, do you separate out all of your internal things from your client things, right? Do you have two separate RMMs? Do you have two separate subscriptions to every SaaS vendor you use, right? Totally separately isolated, or does that make it so complicated that you're actually reducing your security because now you don't have the staff to manage it? What's your take on that? I guess I'm kind of
Um,
taking over your podcast, so I
no, that's a good
apologize
question.
there.
That's
So
great.
there's a few factors at play here. One thing is that, and I was taught this early in my security career, and it did not seem intuitive to me, this idea, but the idea of single point of control. So that is like, well, yeah, you could have a firewall here, and then you could have an intermediary network, and then you could have another firewall here, or you could have like this type of firewall, and then you could have that type of firewall, and you could have stacked rule sets. Like, for example, you could have a software firewall and a hardware firewall, and because that's more secure, right? But the reality is, in the real world, we're all humans and we make human errors. And when we have things with mismatched configurations, it just leads to more confusion and less secure outcomes. Almost always. So there's this concept of single point of control, not duplicating security controls that do the same thing. So if doing what you said resulted in a second user directory as an example, and now we have two user directories and we have to lock out a user, now we have to do it in two places. I hate that idea, right?
Yes.
It's bad enough trying to create user accounts in a standardized way and then remove them or disable them in a standardized way, and making sure that happens timely. That's hard, right? To do it in multiple systems is even harder. So I'm all about centralization of control, not necessarily universal control, like people have hands of God access to everything. Centralization of each security concept, right?
Yes.
So if you have firewalls, you don't need multiple firewalls in a row, right? If you have an access management system, you don't need multiple access management systems, right? So it's another one of those. It depends of like which system are we talking about here, and how would we duplicate it? I think that in some cases, like if you're a small MSP and you work with a bunch of small businesses that each have 20 employees, but you work with 100 of them, right? So now you're talking about 2,000 employees, right? Um, you're probably going to find that a lot of the tools that are right for your 20-person customers are not right for you, right? Because
Yes.
you're managing literally thousands of machines, right? And so you need tools that have that type of scale and comprehensive management abilities. And you may only have 20 people, right? So I think the tool that your customer needs, right, and the tool that you use to manage your customer and the tool you use to manage yourself, it could even be three different things, right? But ideally, you don't have multiple tools that do the exact same thing in an environment in a duplicative way. That doesn't make things more secure. It makes things less secure.
Yeah, because
I
there's more
think,
surface area to make
yeah,
mistakes.
exactly. I think you said the key word there, which is scale, right? So what we did was we did largely separate it because we were big enough that we had completely dedicated separate teams managing internal and clients. And when you have that ability, then it makes sense both from the security separation, but also from the separation of duties aspect to be able to say, okay, my internal guys don't have any access to client stuff and vice versa. Um, that made sense, but it wouldn't have made sense unless we had enough staff to say, okay, you four guys are only going to manage internal. And most organizations, um, I won't say more organizations can't do that until they get to a critical mass of size to be able to dedicate that much staff to it. So again, using the "it depends" phrase, it's a scale thing, right? When you're starting out, and even if you're relatively larger, like 20, 30 people, probably your internal IT is managed by your just most senior techs. And as you get even bigger, then you start having a dedicated internal team. And at that point, maybe it makes sense to have separate systems because then it's easier to define separation within those.
Yeah, and I liked your example earlier of Intune versus, I don't know if it was Systems Manager or what, but like the Azure tools don't have as many knobs and switches, right?
I love knobs and switches.
As
Doesn't that mean it's better if it has knobs and switches?
well, I mean, so some of these systems have more depth to them, right? And sometimes
Hmm.
you need that depth, but your clients may not, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes that depth comes at a cost, and I don't just mean licensing cost or like hardware cost, because that's definitely real, but literally like human time in to maintain this thing cost. So just because you have a security need doesn't mean you need to incur that cost for all of your clients. The same thing's true, and I'm sure this is one of the things that niggle you is not doing a thing, right? Not doing a security thing because you can't figure out how to do it at your scale and your client's scale at the same time, right? And then the thing doesn't get done at all, right? And that's
Yes, exactly.
not just a
Mm.
security thing, any practice in your business, right? But oftentimes a security thing, right?
Yeah,
Oh,
right. And on your Intune, like I used Intune because it made it easy to differentiate, but it could be two separate copies of your RMM system if you're going to manage them as separate entities. It's not, we're not necessarily saying use Intune, use RMM, just think about how you're going to deal with that management aspect. And again, it goes back to your point, Matt, unless you're really going to have a need to manage these differently, like with different teams, like we talked about, the same person or the same group managing two instances of the same system, all that does is make more problems and likely less secure overall.
Yeah, I think the RMM is a great example. If I think about how this plays out in the real world, right? Let's say you're an MSP with 10 people, and you've got I don't know, let's say 6 of those people are like engineers or something like that, right? It might be that that junior guy you just hired um, gets full access to tolerant, like I always pick on car washes, right? A tolerant car wash customer, right? That is not going to leave you if something bad happens, and really there's no data risk there, right? Um, and you give them that client and maybe a few other clients, and you give them full privilege access in those environments, right? But that does not mean you're going to give them full access in your core environment, right? Because
Yes.
maybe you only want them to have access to 5 clients, right? Maybe they're not ready to have access to everything yet. If you were going to give someone full access to one system and not allow them to somehow circumvent that security to then access other systems or to break your own castle, you would have to have
Yeah.
separate environments, right? Or at the very
Yes.
least, separate access management systems, right?
Or if the worst happens and a threat actor is in your RMM system, the absolute last thing you need is to be trying to clean up your own machines before you can even start working on any of the client ones.
Yeah, that's right.
Good
Um,
point.
well, there's a lot of examples I can think of here. So that's the example of maybe your systems need to be different than your clients, both from the perspective of scale, but also maybe like isolation, right? And scale goes both ways because sometimes you're bigger than your client and sometimes you're smaller than your client, right? We didn't
Hmm.
talk about smaller than your client, but that's real too. Someone mentioned government contracting. That's real. As a service provider that might only have a few people in it, you may find that your client has a giant government contract and has like 1,000 employees, right? And they've got CUI or FCI that they need to protect, and none of your other clients do, right? And that might mean a whole separate set of machines for you, right? And you create an
Yeah.
enclave for that client. That's one option, right? You only access those customer systems through systems for that customer, right? That's an option there. And in that case, you would definitely need separate systems.
Yeah, right. That's a good option in many cases. Although I think maybe you've seen different. Many, or at least most organizations don't have one government contracting client, right? It's just not worth setting up all the requirements as a service provider unless you're going to go deep down that rabbit hole. It's hard to justify doing all that for one customer.
It's
Mhm.
it's usually zero or many. You're right.
Yeah.
However, I think that that's changing. I For a few different reasons, but I think that the same requirements that people in the the government contract space have had to deal with for many years are now the same requirements we have in the private sector. And maybe they don't have the same teeth in them, but in many cases they do, right? And so that differentiation of skill set and security is evaporating just a little bit, right? There are now many industries that have the same expectations that the government has, right, in terms of
Right. Right.
depth of security.
That's a
So
good point. Great
that's
point.
happening, and even if the industry doesn't, sometimes the insurer will have that requirement, right? So and then that'll trickle into a requirement that has to go into that private sector customer. So I think that it's interesting when you look at the national cybersecurity strategy, right? This is the way the U.S. federal government has always worked. Is like we see this problem over in the private sector, and the way we're going to solve it is we're going to make all our contractors do this thing, and that's going to have knock-on effects to the wider marketplace. And sometimes it works that way, and sometimes all it does is like make government spending more expensive. I but
Yeah. Make more paperwork, make it more expensive.
yeah, I have
More
seen.
paperwork, more secure.
Yeah, I have seen the federal plan of action and milestones model that for the first few years I only saw it in federal scenarios. It's now standard in the cybersecurity industry. is we now don't talk about yesterday's security, we talk about tomorrow's security. And that was
Right,
the government that
right.
forced that change.
No, good point.
What's the difference
I
between
agree.
yesterday's and tomorrow's?
Well, ideally, if you're going through a due diligence process with someone, their concern is like risk going forward. And for a long time, the audit process was all about risk going backward, right?
Oh, yeah,
With
yeah,
the idea that there's some kind of correlation between the risks
The
of
plan,
yesterday and the risks
the
of tomorrow.
plans being more valuable than the past.
Yeah, what really matters is where's your destination and where are you in that pathway to get to that
Yep.
destination, and is it credible?
Yeah.
And that's way more important than where were you like 4 weeks ago. So,
That's a good point.
yep.
It's becoming at least equally important, right? The historic is important because that it provides some assurances that you didn't get popped 6 months ago and don't know about it yet. But the future is now equally important as the historical data. I think that's a great point.
We chewed through the hour, guys. We're over time.
Man, we could have gone on for another 3 hours.
Quick plugs, Matt. What's the Connectwise project you want to talk about for 30 seconds?
Connectwise project. So one, awesome to see a fantastic time. If you're not familiar with modes theory and that idea of growing your business, go check that out. Take the online assessment for it, and look for more content from us soon, security content specifically.
I've been bringing modes into our sales playbook management, Matt. It's long overdue in the service provider ecosystem. And of course, at Fort Mesa, we help with cybersecurity planning and supporting service providers with both sales, service delivery, and evidencing of their clients' cybersecurity. I think that's it, guys. You want to ring us out, Zach?
Yeah, thank you guys for joining us for another MSP Cyber Roundtable. Thank you to Matt for joining us. Awesome conversation. Next week, we're going to be having Scott Augenbaum, who's a former FBI agent. We're going to be talking about how to protect yourself from APTs, and I'm going to need an acronym support from Matt here, one of the Matts.
Advanced Persistent Threat.
Those sound like you need to be protected from them. So that'll be an exciting, great conversation. Make sure to check us out on YouTube if you haven't seen any of our content before, or if you're new to the Roundtable. We've got a great library of educational content there. Make sure to subscribe and then like us on LinkedIn for more educational content here. Thanks, everybody, and have a great weekend. Bye.
Bye, guys.